With young people, and also full to bursting with burgers. Today it's pastries, last night it was burgers, so I'm beginning to, there's a food kind of theme here at Deeside, and I'm realizing every time I come here for a visit I then need to take up a new exercise regime to do with the pounds I've put on over the weekend. But great to be here with you, really looking forward to a packed, confident Christianity this morning, which we're going to dive into in just a moment. Before we dive into our first topic and we think about how we can learn to ask good questions, start conversations about faith with our friends, learning from how Jesus did it. Quick housekeeping announcement. I'm going to send around while I talk a couple of clipboards, and as that clipboard goes by, if you jot your email address down on that clipboard, we'll do a couple of things for you at Solas. First thing we'll do is we'll take your email and we'll sell it to Google. No, we won't do that, just joking. What we'll do is we will send you the slides from each of the talks this morning. So all the stuff that comes up on the screens behind myself and Steve and Gavin as we speak. If you see things that are useful and you think, I've got to try and write that down, do not worry. If you just provide us your email address, then we will send you all of that next week, as well as some resources kind of linked to whatever comes up in the questions. And boy, last night there were some good questions. If you're thinking that as the older members of the community you can rival the young people last night, that is quite a hill to climb. There were some astonishing questions last night, so we'll see what we come up with this morning. But let's dive in then to our first topic and think about how we can learn to ask questions the way that Jesus did. Looking around the room, I recognise some faces from when myself and Gavin were here a few months ago for the evening session. And if you remember, if you were there at that session, I did a talk called How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, which is the title of my new book on evangelism. And we talked then about how you can learn to ask questions of our friends and our neighbours and colleagues, start conversations going. If you were there, then hopefully what I'm about to share with you will build on that. And if you weren't there, if this is your first time at a Confident Christianity event, then hopefully there'll be something really in this first talk for you too, as we learn how to have conversations the way that Jesus did. So to set the scene, I was thinking about the other day, I'm struck by the fact that every morning in my home, when I'm at home with my wife and kids, we have a family devotional. We gather the kids together in the bedroom or around the breakfast table. We look at a Bible passage together. And as part of that, what we'll do is we'll look at a Bible passage and we'll ask some questions. We'll often ask the kids questions to get them thinking about the text. At the moment, we're going through the book of Acts. And it's great fun, reading a passage of the Bible and then asking an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old some questions to get them thinking. And I'm struck by the fact that very often when I ask my kids a question, they will default to giving the standard Christian answer. You'll say, what do you think about this? And they'll say Jesus. They'll always go for the Jesus answer because particularly my 8-year-old son has figured out, I'm not fully sure what Dad is looking for here, but if I say Jesus, there's a greater than 90% chance I will indeed get it correct. I know we're not alone in this, by the way. I heard of one family, recently I heard of one family who mid-family devotions were interrupted by a knock at the door. And immediately, who can that be at the door? The mother said. And immediately, her 4-year-old leapt up and shouted, Jesus, still in Bible answer mode, ran to the front door along with her 7-year-old brother, flung open the door, and then shocked the postman by yelling out, Mummy, it's not Jesus, it's the mail. And the 4-year-old then added, I think Jesus probably actually uses the chimney, not the door. To which the postman helpfully replied, I think you'll find that's Father Christmas, not the Royal Mail. Much confusion caused. We may smile knowingly at such antics and such naivety, but I'm struck by the fact that we're not immune from that tendency sometimes, those of us who are older and more grown-up parts of the church. We can sometimes be tempted towards simplistic sound bites, or what one of my friends likes to call bumper sticker theology. One of my American friends loves to use that phrase, and I often wonder what they meant by bumper sticker theology, until one day I was walking through the car park of a church where I'd been speaking, and I came across this in the car park of this church, where there was a white, I think it was a Honda with that sticker on the back, large, bold, colourful letters announcing Jesus is the answer. And I thought, now I know what we mean by bumper sticker theology. Because don't misunderstand me, I totally agree that Jesus is the answer. But of course the problem is, if that's all we're saying, if we simply stop at that point, that raises the question, doesn't it? Jesus is the answer to what? Precisely. And that's the question I think a lot of our friends, quite frankly, out there in the world are asking. Okay, you Christians think that Jesus is important, but why is he important? What is he the answer to? And the problem is that if in the church we continually give these kind of soundbite-shaped answers, they can sometimes give the impression that Christians, we are shallow, we are trite, that we are sort of fairly dim. We haven't thought through some of the big questions of the age. And perhaps rather than simply parroting things like Jesus is the answer, perhaps what we need to do is learn to talk to our friends, figure out the issues that our friends are thinking about, the questions that they have, the challenges they're struggling with. And then we need to figure out, how does the gospel and the message of Jesus connect with the issues that they're going through? And if we do that, we can learn to show people how Jesus is incredibly relevant and is indeed the answer to those very questions that they're wrestling with. And I think the motivation for all of this comes from the observation that Jesus himself loved questions. Jesus loved questions in some ways far more than answers. When you read through the Gospels, you discover this pretty quickly. Someone has done the statistics. Somebody has counted. Some theologian, probably with insomnia and far too much spare time, has gone through the Gospels and calculated, and it has been calculated that Jesus asks 307 questions in the Gospels. He asked 307 questions. Interestingly, he is asked himself by others 183, and he only answers 8 questions directly. Only 8 times in the Gospels does Jesus answer a question directly, which means, by the way, if you were there in the first century and you asked Jesus a question, if you were in the crowds and you raised your hand, he was 40 times more likely to ask you a question back than to give you an answer. I don't know whether Jeremy here is the same as the pastor, whether his statistics are similar. You can try this out on a Sunday morning. Try asking him a question in the sermon and see where you get. 40 times more likely. It fascinates me. Jesus, when you read the Gospels, does a number of things, doesn't he? Jesus asks questions of invitation. Who are you looking for? Jesus asks questions about identity. Who do you say that I am? Jesus asks questions about attitudes. Why do you grumble about the speck in your friend's eye and you haven't seen the log in your own? Jesus asks questions about love. Don't even the tax collectors love those who love them? Jesus asks questions about healing. Do you want to get well? He asks questions about the purpose of life. Isn't life about more than food and clothing? Jesus asked questions about God's kingdom. What can I compare the kingdom of God to? He asks questions about faith. Do you believe that I can do this? He asks questions about obedience. Why do you call me Lord, but not do what I ask? He asked me questions about discipleship. Do you too want to leave me? And he asks questions about eternal life. All who believe in me will never die. Do you believe this? So when it comes to using questions ourselves in evangelism, either to start spiritual conversations or to keep spiritual conversations going, I think we can do no better than learning from Jesus, the master question asker. So what I want to do in the bulk of my talk this morning, this first talk, I'm going to walk you through 2 conversations that Jesus has in the Gospels that have a question at the heart of them. We'll look at what Jesus does and how he uses a question, and then we'll take a contemporary application of the same method to show how we can learn from Jesus and his conversations and apply those in our conversations with our friends and our neighbours and our colleagues and so on. So in the first example I want to show you, we'll take a look at how Jesus uses a question to turn the tables. He's going to take a trap that people are going to try and spring on him, and he's going to turn it neatly back onto them with a question, and then I'll show you how we can do this ourselves with a real-world contemporary example. So let's start with Jesus. So here we go in Luke chapter 20, verses 1 through 8. There's this well-known story. Luke tells us one day as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things," they said. "Who gave you this authority?" Jesus replied, "Well, I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven, or was it of human origin?" They discussed it among themselves, and they said, "Well, if we say from heaven, he will ask us, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say it's of human origin, all the people will stone us, because they're persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered, we don't know where it was from." So Jesus said, "Well, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." I love this little encounter here, because here's Jesus faced with this hostile mob of questioners. The chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, they have ganged up. They obviously figure there is safety in numbers. They've ganged up together and gone after Jesus. But he doesn't get drawn into a debate. He could have had this really detailed debate. He could have given them a direct answer. None of those things. But there's no point in Jesus doing that, because the people he's talking to are not interested. These are the group who've come to him. They're not interested where his authority comes from. They simply want to shut him down. They want to tie him up in knots. They want to cause problems. So with one question, Jesus turns the entire tables and silences them and pulls the rug from underneath them. We can do the same thing in everyday life. There are examples I can think of for me where I've taken the same approach that Jesus has taken. So let me tell you an example. I had a friend actually who was chatting once on one occasion to university students about faith. The conversation was actually going really well. My friend was having a really good conversation with this student about faith and Christianity, when another university student on the campus, who was well known as a loudmouth skeptic, walked past and said very rudely and very loudly, "Religion is a load of," a rude word was used, "rubbish." He then added, "Christianity is just a psychological crutch for people who are far too weak and scared to face up to the realities of life." Now, there are lots of things wrong with that statement, but of course the biggest problem is, like many atheist sound bites, it self-destructs. And so my friend, rather than say something rude, or rather than get sort of terrified and stop talking, my friend simply replied, "Hey, what if it's atheism that's the psychological crutch? What if it's atheists who are afraid there might be a God and that there might be implications to that, so they've grasped hold of atheism because they're too afraid to be held to account for how they've lived their lives?" What my friend had basically done is take the Jesus method. Using the same method that Jesus had used with authority, my friend played that same routine on that atheist interrupter. And it was really interesting what happened. This overconfident atheist, my friend said, stopped, paused, thought about it for a moment, and then laughed and said, "Oh, well played. That was really well played. Well done." And that gave my friends the ability to then gently suggest, maybe, do you know what? Maybe when it comes to beliefs, when it comes to the deeply held beliefs that we have, maybe what really matters is not how they make us feel, but whether they are actually true. And he was able to add to that loudmouth atheist student. He was also able to say, do you know what? Sometimes Christianity is far from comforting. Sometimes I find myself thinking, on some days I do get up in the morning and think the easiest path would be atheism, because it would allow me to do exactly as I wish. But I don't walk that path simply because I don't believe that it happens to be true. And that conversation continued after that. And say, all my friend did there was he took exactly the same method we've seen here in Luke's Gospel and applied it in a real-world situation. So you can use a question to, as it were, turn the tables. Let's look at one more example from Jesus, and then we'll draw the threads together. So second example, here we're going to see how Jesus on one occasion used a question to reveal, to probe a contradiction in the beliefs of the people who, again, were causing problems for him, the religious leadership who wanted to shut him down. And again, he uses a question on this occasion, again, to navigate through the conversation. So this time we're going to go from Luke's Gospel last time. Now we're in Mark's Gospel. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 12, verses 35 through 37. Another well-known incident in the Gospels. Mark tells us, while Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, "Why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David? Because after all, David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." David himself calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? And Mark ends this little passage by pointing out the large crowd listened to him with delight. He doesn't tell us at this point quite how the religious leaders are dealing with it at this point. I imagine a whole bunch of them over on the side with steam coming out of both ears at this point. You see, questions around the identity of the Messiah were very lively. It's a very lively debate in first century Judaism. And of course, Jesus was well known for claiming directly and indirectly that he was the Messiah, the long-awaited Saviour of Israel. And to the religious leadership, that went down about as well as a glass of rancid milk. They hated the idea, hence their constant challenges about the way that Jesus and his followers behaved. How can he be the Messiah? He heals on the Sabbath. How can he be the Messiah? He dares to forgive sin, and so on and so on. And I think some of the most fascinating exchanges we have in the Gospels actually come from Jesus pushing back on all of this in story and word and deed. But here we see Jesus push back on it by using a question. Again, he turns the tables and he goes on the offensive as he points out to the crowds that the religious leaders, this is really odd, because on the one hand, they're claiming the Messiah must be David's son, yet David calls the Messiah his Lord. And he's basically saying to the crowds, you know, these guys over here, don't you think they've missed something? And what Jesus is doing there is using a question to just tease apart a tension, a contradiction, a difficulty in the beliefs of the religious leaders. And we can learn to do the same thing. When we're engaging with or having conversations with people who don't share our Christian faith, we can also use questions to gently tease out where there are tensions or difficulties or contradictions in what they believe. Rather than turn to our friend, our neighbour, our colleague and go, "You're wrong," that bluntly, which can just cause the barriers to come up, the drawbridge comes down, the portcullis drops, and they're not going to engage with us. Our friends just get defensive. If you can learn to use questions, you can actually get far more of a conversation going and it be far more effective. So how can we do what Jesus did? How can we use the method that Jesus uses here in a contemporary conversation? Well, let me give you a good example of that. A good example of using this Jesus approach in a conversation comes from an experience that a friend's daughter, her name is Alice, had the other year. So Alice, at the point this story happens, she was in high school. She's now graduated high school and is at university. But at this point, I think she's about 17, 18. And she was discussing with a school friend faith issues. Spirituality had come up, faith had come up. Her friend knew she was a Christian. The conversation had begun. And I think her friend said to her something like, "Well, why are you a Christian? What are the reasons you're a Christian?" And Alice had shared a few. And one of the things Alice had said was that she thought that the existence of moral values was a good argument for God. You know, if there is a God, that's a really good explanation for why some things are really right and some are really wrong. If we live in a godless universe, that's very hard to explain. And then Alice's friend had cheerfully responded, "Oh, we don't need God to be good. You don't need God to be good. We can just decide what's right and wrong for ourselves, right? We can just get to decide that. And of course, what's right for me isn't necessarily right for you, and what's wrong for you isn't necessarily wrong for me. Isn't the joy that we just get to make it up for ourselves? And of course, whatever you do, though, you must never tell another person that they're wrong." Now, bemused at this extreme display of situational ethics, Alice asked a few follow-up questions. So she turned to her friend. She said, "Well, surely murder is always wrong, right? I mean, always wrong." And her friend literally said, "Well, I couldn't say. There might be times when it's okay." "Assault and battery," I think Alice said. "Well, it'd be wrong. Maybe it's wrong for you to do it, but I couldn't say. It might be wrong for me to do it rather, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's wrong for you. Again, maybe it's appropriate." Theft. Couldn't say. And again, Alice kept offering things, and her friend literally would not be pinned down. Finally, in desperation, Alice reached for the go-to example in all these conversations. She turned to her friend and said, "Well, come on, Hitler. Hitler then, surely what Hitler and the Nazis did is wrong." And literally, her friend said to her, "Look, I find all of that horrific, but I couldn't say it was absolutely categorically wrong. I don't think it's appropriate to say that." What on earth do you do when you're faced with that kind of conversation? And I have to say, that's not unusual. I spend a lot of my time on university campuses and talking to students and young adults, and you often come across versions of that belief, that morality is utterly, utterly, utterly relative. That idea is in our school system from kindergarten through to university. But Alice's response was brilliant. I was so impressed when I heard what she did. She looked at her classmate, and then she pointed to a plastic cup on the desk in front of her. And she said to her friend, is that your coffee that you've got there in that mug? And her friend went, yeah, it's my cappuccino. Brilliant, said Alice. I love coffee. Grabbed her friend's mug and started swigging at the coffee. Her friend goes, what the heck are you doing? That's my coffee. And Alice said, well, that's all right. I'm stealing it. Carry on. And her friend, what do you mean you're stealing it? That's my coffee. And Alice said, I know it's your coffee, but you have convinced me that we get to decide good and evil for ourselves. You've also said there's nothing inherently wrong with theft, and I agree with you, so I'm nicking your coffee. It might be wrong for you to steal my coffee, but it's perfectly okay for me to steal your coffee. Do you have a problem with that? There was a long silence, and her friend went, yeah, I do have a problem with that. And then Alice said, so do you think it might just be the case that there is at least some moral values that are bigger than individual preference, even if we can't get further than you should never steal another person's coffee? And Alice said it was really interesting. After that, the conversation went in a much more productive direction. And all that Alice had done, and she hadn't realized it at the time, it was afterwards I heard the conversation. I just said, do you know, you just did what Jesus did in Mark chapter 12. You just used a question to effectively, by saying, may I steal your coffee? What you effectively did is you did what Jesus did, and you showed dramatically that there was a massive contradiction in your friend's worldview, that you can't actually believe this is my own coffee, keep your hands off it, and that morality is totally relative. Good and evil are things we make up for ourselves. So again, another example of how you can take the Jesus way of using questions and bring it into everyday conversation. Well, let's draw the threads together then. We've seen that Jesus was a master at asking questions. We've given just two examples in my the yellow book I was waving around earlier. I have dozens more examples of how Jesus does this and how we can learn from him. Jesus used questions to start conversations. He used questions to redirect conversations, to expose assumptions. He used questions to make people think. Questions were central, absolutely central to the ministry of Jesus. And I think it's vital that as churches we learn from this and learn well from this, because sadly, sometimes the church has ended up with having a bit of a reputation of being a place where questions are not always welcome. A few years ago, I was chatting with a university student. This was back when I lived in Canada, and I was at the University of Toronto, was talking to a student I'd met there at an event. And I asked him for his story, and he said, well, I used to be a Christian, but I'm not anymore. I'm now an atheist. And I remember saying to him, oh, that's sorry to hear that. What happened? How did that happen? And he said, well, it's like this, Andy. He said, I was raised in as he put it, a very fundamentalist church where questions were never encouraged. Whatever the pastor and the elders said just went. You were expected to believe and not raise your hand at all, and so on. And he said, but I fell in love, as well as with the Bible, I fell in love with science. So he said, when it came time to go to university, I applied to come here to the University of Toronto to study biology. And he said, I very quickly discovered I was being taught things in my biology class that clashed with what I'd been taught in church about the Bible. So he said, I did the obvious thing. I booked an appointment to see my pastor to ask for some help. I said, brilliant. That was absolutely the right thing to do. So did your pastor walk you through some of the ways to engage those questions, introduce you to Christians who are active in the sciences, many good books on that subject? He went, well, no, not exactly. I went, what do you mean not exactly? What did your pastor do? He said, well, my pastor looked at me and he said, it's really easy, son. You choose the Bible or choose biology. Next question, please. I said, what did you do? He said, I chose biology. And really, really tragic story. I remember being really kind of both moved and actually quite angry by that story. It moved me deeply because of that one clueless interchange. That young man walked away from faith. Thankfully, by God's grace, I was able to introduce him to some wonderful resources written by Christians in the sciences, but there had been tremendous damage done because his pastor simply hadn't gone, that's a brilliant question. Let's talk about that. He hadn't asked a question back, He hadn't engaged the young man in dialogue, and in so doing, he convinced that university student there were no answers. But the good news is, if we learn from Jesus the importance of questions, how to ask good questions, if our friends discover in us people who are passionate about our faith in Christ, but also people who welcome questions, who want to draw them into conversation, then I firmly believe that God can work through that powerfully. Because we live in an age where actually there is a spiritual hunger like I haven't seen for a long time outside the four walls of this church. There is a tremendous opportunity for the gospel right now, as I think a lot of people look at what's going on in the world, and people are looking for hope, looking for meaning, looking for purpose, looking for something that answers life's big questions. What a tremendous opportunity we have as followers of Christ to draw them to Jesus, who is the answer, but the way to that answer may be through learning to ask really good questions, just like Jesus himself did. Thanks for listening. Liz.
Thank you, Andy. It's so helpful, isn't it, to think of the power of a good question.